All right, well, welcome everybody. I think we'll get started. Want to let folks know that at the start of the meeting here, we have the chat off just so that it isn't a distraction to the information that we're presenting. And then once the presentation is over, we'll open up the chat and field questions and try to provide answers for everything that's on folks' mind tonight. I'm Dustin Bengtson. I'm the Operations Project Manager for the Corps of Engineers, Willamette Valley and Rogue Basin projects. I have been in the basin working in the Willamette Valley since 1993, so quite a while. Most of you remember my predecessor, Eric Peterson, who was in his job as the OPM for a number of years, and I've taken his place now. So it's good to be here tonight. Appreciate the opportunity to share with you what our plan is for this year. I want to introduce a few other folks that will be helping us along the way. Greg Taylor, who's probably a familiar face to many of you in these briefings. He's been in the basin for over 20 years as well, working for the Corps, and longer than that on some other issues. We'll be helping with the technical part of the presentation. And then we've got some other Corps folks online tonight that can help during the Q&A session. Our goal tonight is to provide you, Greg, you can bump to the next slide, or actually we can start sharing the slides. We'll do just a little bit of, I think, what folks are used to seeing, a little bit of overview of the project, just to orient folks to what the Willamette Valley Project is, how we operate, and what we're doing. Talk a little bit about our authorized purposes. Go ahead and go to the next slide, Greg. And talk just briefly about how we manage water consistent with our authorizations, trying to meet a number of the objectives that folks are familiar with and maybe some that they aren't. And then we'll talk specifically about our plans for the drawdowns this year. This is the third season. This view is good, Greg. You seeing it just right? This is our third season of operational fish passage, or drawdowns, I think it's most commonly referred to. But there are some significant differences this year, and so we'll want to talk about that, things that we have learned over past years, efforts to adapt our operations to improve on them and mitigate some of the impacts, as well as the continued effort to evaluate their effectiveness. And then, like I said, once we get to the technical presentation, we'll open up the chat and spend as much time as we need to answering questions. All right, Greg, go ahead to the next slide. Just for general orientation, when I refer to the Willamette Valley Project, most people think just of the 13 dams that we operate. 8 of those facilities produce hydropower. We also have a number of other features that are a part of this project, including mitigation fish hatcheries, an authorization for a navigation channel that is still part of our original authorization. Willamette Falls Locks is a component that was originally kind of a part of the Willamette system, and then hundreds of miles of bank stabilization projects, revetments on the main stem and the tributaries associated with the Willamette as well. So a large geography, highly modified system that has been in operation since the late 40s, early 40s in one fashion or another. Next slide. I just throw this next slide in because I think it's a interesting reminder of how we got here, right? And how different the Willamette Basin was prior to dam construction, in ways that were good and in ways that were very impactful to people. And as the result of the system that flooded regularly and the impacts that it had on people's lives. Next slide, Greg. You saw a number of authorities coming our way, and things that are important for a federal agency. One is an authority, gives us the ability or the permission to do things. The other is appropriations, the funding to do things, and we'll talk a little bit about both perhaps tonight. But our authorities evolved from the late 30s and early authorizations for flood control dams, the first 7 dams in the Willamette system, construction starting in the late 30s. To authorizations that came in the 50s and 60s, providing the authority to construct the dams as we kind of recognize them today. Blue River being the last dam that was completed of the 13 and online in 1969. And those dams, this system has operated now with all of those features in place for over 50 years, trying to provide a range of benefits that are identified in these original authorities, these things that we can do or are tasked to do with the infrastructure that we have in place. Go to the next slide, Greg. The end result of those authorities were these structures that most of you are familiar with. There's two other features. I mentioned that I'm the operations manager for the Rogue Basin as well. We've got 2 or 2.5 dams, if you look at it that way, down in the Rogue Basin. All of these dams are different in different ways. And so what we're trying to do, or what we've tried to do over time, is manage for this range of benefits under our authorities with these very different pieces of infrastructure. And we're taking things that were contemplated, constructed, and have been operated since the 40s in some cases to try to achieve objectives that we recognize now. And we're using the same infrastructure today that we've been using over time. And that's a challenging thing. The next slide, Greg. So when we talk about authorized purposes or authorities that we operate under, almost everybody recognizes flood risk management and is kind of a primary driver for the Willamette system. We have about 2/3 of the population of the state of Oregon, many of them living in or adjacent to the floodplain. The benefits associated with flood risk management are enormous. Going back to 2019, you've probably seen a briefing before. We had a fairly wet, kind of a small flood event, prevented over $2 billion of damages in a 7-day span. And so as infrastructure, population increases in the Willamette Valley, the risks that we manage around flooding to people and infrastructure continue to grow in terms of their economic benefit. All of these other authorities or authorized purposes are things that we try to achieve the best balance of benefits that we can within available resources, our legal requirements, and the limitations of our infrastructure. And most of you benefit from these in one way or another, whether we recognize it or not all the time. As I mentioned, 8 of our facilities produce hydropower, not nearly as much hydropower as we had produced historically because we've gone through some significant changes in our operations. Recreation is tremendously important to a number of our communities, and a lot of our economy has evolved in these smaller communities around recreation opportunities at core reservoirs. Our fish and wildlife program, and we're going to talk a lot about that, especially our efforts to address impacts to federally listed fish species, but we also have a number of terrestrial species that we manage on project lands in the Willamette. There is a navigation authority on the books that we obviously aren't really operating to anymore, but we do use the stored water to improve water quality and flow conditions downstream for a number of reasons. And then, both municipal and industrial water supply and irrigation is increasingly important in the Willamette as well. All of these things, again, are a function of us trying to balance within available water, available resources, and the infrastructure that we have in place. Next slide, Greg.
Hey, Dustin, just real quick. I just had a person that texted me that said they can hear us, but they're having trouble seeing this. They're not seeing the slides. So it might be worth polling some folks to see if the rest of the group can see the slides. It's like
I can see them just fine. I can also turn on settings so people can react and let you know. Just 1 second. Hello, everyone. This is Kelly James. I'm helping facilitate.
And I don't know if that's specific to an individual. This is being recorded, and we will have that posted. We will also be able to post the slides. So there will be an opportunity to see them if we can't figure out a way to help here.
All right. So folks can use that little reaction button at the top. If you can hear us, please give us a thumbs up.
A number of thumbs. Okay.
Great, thank you.
Thanks, Kelly. So I mentioned, our operation and our authorization, and the slide that's in front of you now is something we refer to as the water control diagram. It's an authorized operation, and each of our dams has a water control diagram that's a little bit unique to that project. This generic one is really modeled after Detroit. but it gives you an indication of how we operate each one of our dams seasonally and from a storage standpoint. So if you're looking on the bottom axis, there are months of the year, and on the top of the graph, you see us transitioning from January, where we're in major flood season, and as those flood risks diminish, we slowly start to fill these pools, trying to store as much water as we can with all of our constraints that we have in place to achieve that maximum storage somewhere in the early to mid-May timeframe. And based on what we have available to us in the system, we then start to use that water for that variety of authorities and purposes that I mentioned earlier. And that's everything from power production to achieving water quality targets downstream, and we'll talk about those minimum flows and how we're using those. Increasingly, our ability to store water has changed, right? And as we start to look at modified operations, trying to improve on our conditions for ESA listed species, that decision space that we have, that blue area that's inside that's called conservation storage, we have some changes in how much of that water we have to work with. There are other things that come into play, and we have some risk reduction measures associated with dam safety questions that we have elevated around seismic issues at our facilities. And as those technical issues are getting worked through, again, we have some reduction in the amount of stored water we have. So the demands on an already complicated system become increasingly difficult or challenging to manage as we're trying to both meet the needs of the public and meet our legal requirements for things like federally listed species. Next slide, Greg. So a different way, I think, of looking at this, and maybe a little bit more of an interesting way, is to look at a site-specific example of that complex balance that we're trying to achieve. So this is Dexter Dam, right off of Highway 58, just downstream of Lookout Point. And if you look in the upper right-hand corner, you say weather and water supply. We'll start up there, and we manage within the uncertainties around just weather and how much water is going to be available to us. If we aren't cautious and careful, the impacts to downstream can be significant. Each one of these dams is considered a high hazard dam based not on its condition, but on the people that we protect and the resources that are downstream. There's also that uncertainty of forecast and water supply. So in that gradual refill cycle, we can't get too far out of that authorized curve based on an authority, but also based on a real risk downstream, that if we get that wrong and we can't evacuate that water, we have the risk of doing damages to people's property and potentially to people themselves. So we've got that uncertainty, and then what are we managing for? So we're looking at those downstream control points, trying to ensure that we're operating within bank full conditions and minimizing impacts during high water events. At the same time, we're trying to take into account minimum flow requirements and meet flow objectives both in the tributaries and on the main stem of the Willamette. Trying to do that in ways that, if you look at the lower left, take into account the needs of those federally listed fish and the life history requirements, or impacts to drinking water systems from things like blue-green algae. And all of that while we're still trying to maintain the system. And so that right-hand side, as we're looking at trying to find time to do outages for units and do maintenance on our facilities, that is in balance with trying to conduct temperature operations and minimize total dissolved gas downstream to ensure that we have access for recreation for boaters and other folks on the water. And then a number of things that we call special operations requests that are driven by either needs for information or specific maintenance needs, construction projects. We currently have one going on below Dexter for an adult fish passage facility. And all of these things just increase the complexity at not only a single project, but then you magnify that over the 13 dams we have in the system, trying to meet those demands as best we can. So it has gotten, in the time that I have been in the Willamette, much, much more complicated to provide that balance, achieve that ideal balance of services. And so that brings us to today. Again, still in some ways a very novel operation for us. It's only the third year that we're in this operational fish passage at some of these projects, but we're working to adapt our operations to improve on those, not only from a fish standpoint, but also from a public impact standpoint. And so Greg will talk a little bit about what we've got planned for this year, how we've adapted to what we've learned over time, and how we'll be monitoring as we work through this season's operation.
All right. Thanks, Dustin. And hopefully everybody can hear me. I'll try to project. I don't always project well, so I'll try to speak up. So Dustin mentioned operational fish passages, and that's big picture what we're going to talk about from here on. Operational fish passage comes in several different flavors, but what we're going to focus on tonight is drawdowns. It is a tool that has been used actually going back into the 1960s. We've used drawdowns at these dams to try to facilitate downstream fish passage. So I thought I'd give you a little bit of background about the drawdowns and talking a little about more detail, and then I'll kind of move into what we've been doing at Lookout Point and Green Peter, the ones that have gotten the most attention over time, and then what our plans are for the coming years. So hopefully that will be helpful. So drawdowns, as Dustin mentioned, and when he was talking about our water control diagram, we are doing these every year at the Willamette project, right? That's by design. And so a drawdown in and of itself is really something we do to lower the elevation of the reservoir to meet a specific authorized purpose or an objective. So for us, seasonally, the authorized purpose that we're meeting is flood damage reduction. Okay, we're lowering pools intentionally so that we have capacity to catch water to minimize flooding impacts. And so that is a drawdown that we do every year. Other times we're doing these drawdowns for a specific objective, fish passage. So if you look to the right of the screen here, we're going below our minimum conservation pool, bringing that pool down in this example, and that's helping us facilitate fish passage. So that gives you a little bit of flavor for the types of drawdowns or that we're doing. And as it relates to fish passage, the drawdowns that we've done are kind of two types of those, and they're very different. They're very different in terms of what we see related to fish passage, but also related to sediment delivery downstream of the dam. And the two types that we've done are on the left here. You can see this is at Fall Creek Reservoir. This is a full stream bed drawdown. So we are literally taking that reservoir and draining it completely. This is the intake. Everything that's coming down through that old reservoir is really just the river. And that's that all that remains. And then that river goes into our intake through the dam and goes downstream. And so that full stream bed drawdown is one, again, that we've done at Fall Creek. Over at Green Peter, Lookout, and this is the more typical version of the reservoirs that we've done. We draw the pool down, but there's still a residual reservoir in place. And so we're calling that a partial reservoir drawdown. We're bringing the pool down further than we normally would, but there's a reservoir that remains in place. And that has real consequences, again, on what we see with both fish passage, but also especially what we see with sediment downstream of the dam. So why do we do these? Well, we do them for several different reasons. Again, I mentioned we're doing these seasonally for other authorized purposes. But the recent drawdowns that we've done, those have really been driven by, in some cases, litigation, but big picture, it's really about ESA compliance. So our compliance with the Endangered Species Act, we have a number of fish species that are listed in the basin. And so we've been trying to reestablish and sustain populations of spring chinook and winter steelhead in historic habitats above our dams. And the way you do that ultimately is you've got to, the juveniles that are produced by putting those fish above the dam, they have to find their way out. And then they got to survive when they do migrate out of that dam. And so the drawdowns are really a tool to help us do that. They really, on the biological side, they increase what we call fish passage efficiency. That's just a fancy term for helping fish find their way out. And they increase survival, right? So that's how many fish would make it successfully through the dam in comparison to, say, a baseline operation where we weren't drawing the pool down. And then in some cases, we have some benefits around reduced predation and competition in the reservoirs, mostly around that full stream bed drawdown that I mentioned, but in some cases with the partial reservoir drawdowns too. So how does this work? And how does it work as a way to improve fish passage? So here's a graphic, and if you think back to the water control diagram and us being full, we have to work with the infrastructure that we have at these dams. In the case of Green Peter, Lookout, Detroit, what we typically have is spillways that are pretty high in the elevation. Penstocks, this is our intake to our turbine, if you want to think of it that way. And a regulating outlet, which is kind of a lower level way of spilling water out the dam. And so in the summer, in the late spring and summer, when the pools are full, these juvenile fish that are trying to find their way out of our dams, they're surface oriented. And so if you've been to Detroit, Green Peter, or Lookout, you may have seen our spillways operating in the spring and the summertime. That really is all about providing a service route where these fish are in close proximity and a safe route for them to find their way out. And that works. That works in the spring, it works in the summer, and fish certainly use those spillways. But as we bring the pool down, we're really only left with two routes. And so this would be in the fall and the winter. And the two routes that we have at most of these dams are through our turbine units and through our regulating outlets. Our turbine units, it depends on the project. Not all turbine units have high mortality associated with them, and they're very important features for a whole variety of reasons. But the ones at Lookout, Green Peter, and at Detroit do generally have relatively high mortality associated with them. So they're not a safe route typically for fish. The safe route that is available for fish is this regulating outlet. But the challenge is typically those regulating outlets are quite deep, and the fish don't typically find them very effectively. So the whole concept, if you can remember one thing about this presentation tonight, the whole concept of the drawdowns is to just narrow up the distance to where the fish are near the surface to where that safe route is out of the dam. And that is that regulating outlet. And so we just draw that pool down. And the idea is to just put those fish in proximity of that regulating outlet so they can find it effectively. That's all we're trying to do. It's not tricky. What will drive how far we go down is really where those regulating outlets are in an individual pool. So at Green Peter, that is it, just by dumb luck, they're very, very deep. That was by design because we didn't want them to influence a fish passage device that we had in the reservoir. At other projects at Lookout in Detroit, they're shallower. And so drawdowns you do there tend not to be as deep because we don't have to go down as far to put the fish in proximity to find that safe outlet out of the dam. We're doing these at 4 locations currently, and with the possibility of doing something at Detroit in the fall of 2026. So we're doing these at Fall Creek, I've mentioned that, Lookout Point, Green Peter, and Cougar. The one at Cougar is quite shallow. It's not nearly as noticeable as the Green Peter and Lookout Point drawdowns, but we do have 5 of these that are occurring in the basin eventually with Detroit down the road. So let's spend a little more time looking specifically at the drawdowns at Lookout Point and at Green Peter. Those have been a big change from how we've operated historically, and something that's gotten a lot of attention, obviously, in the last several years. So this is Lookout Point. Here is the water control diagram that Dustin went over previously, and each of the projects have one of these. So at Lookout Point, the normal operation would be to draw the pool down by December 1st to that minimum conservation pool level. and then it would start its refill in February. But with these drawdowns in place, what we're doing is we're drawing the pool down. Instead of stopping at that minimum conservation pool elevation, we're going 75 additional feet. What that does, it puts us in within about 25 feet of our regulating outlet gate that I previously showed you on that diagram. So again, just lowers that depth in the reservoir so these fish can find that safe route out of the dam. At lookout point, it's a 75-foot drawdown. In the first 2 years that we did this, in 2023 and in 2024, we were trying to get to that target elevation of 750 by mid-November. And then we were required to hold that for 30 days and then bring the pool back up in mid-December. So we're outside of the injunction and the litigation that drove that particular set of operations. We're now operating under a biological opinion that was issued in late 2024. And in that opinion, we have a slightly modified version of this drawdown. So with the new drawdown, you can see this purple line here is lookout point in 2025. We are shooting to get down to that target elevation, not on November 15th, but on December 1st. And then we are going to hold that for 2 weeks and then begin to refill the project on the 16th of December. So that is a change. Take home, we're shifting later. So we're 2 weeks later, and we are only holding at the target elevation for 2 weeks versus 30 days. That's your take home on the modification of the drawdowns this year versus last. So that's lookout point. Just want to hit on what we've seen with one of the bigger impacts associated with drawing these pools down, which has been, kind of the release of sediment. And we measured some of this, at least in the form of turbidity, which is not an exact measurement of how much sediment is passing downstream, but it gives you a sense of that. And so what we've seen at lookout point in now 3 years is that both the duration that we're seeing high levels of turbidity and the magnitude, like how much turbidity we're seeing, is dropping. So if you look at what happened in 2023, here's a measure, and background levels of turbidity in our systems, just to give you a number, 1, 2, 3, really low, as used on this scale. And so we have very low backgrounds of turbidity in our systems. And you can see during the drawdown in 2023, those levels went up at lookout as high as 700 in some cases. In 2024, we saw a pretty significant reduction in that, both in the peak number and kind of the duration that we saw high levels of turbidity out of the project. And in 2025 to date, that's your number. You can't even see it. So it's right down there at that background elevation, that background level of 2, 3, 4. We just have not seen the turbidity pick up yet. Now, to be fair, because we've pushed the operation out to the right, we are at a higher elevation so far than we would have been back in 2023 and 2024 at the same time. But we are still seeing much lower turbidity than we would have predicted based on where we are in the reservoir at this time and what we saw in 2024. So it's a good sign that we're thinking we're going to end up with another reduction in both duration and magnitude of turbidity at lookout and at Green Peter in 2025. So this is Green Peter, and I mentioned that it's a deeper drawdown than what we see at lookout point. Again, that's driven only by the depth of the regulating outlets at Green Peter Dam. So this is a 142-foot drawdown from elevation 922. So this is our normal 922 down to 780. So within 25 feet of that regulating outlet. And today, as of today, we're at elevation 826. So we got another 46 feet to go in that drawdown. We're about 2/3 of the way there. And again, you can see in previous years, in 2023 and 2024, we were already down at the target elevation under those older drawdowns. Again, we're pushing this drawdown out to the right. So we're shooting for December 1st. We're going to hold that for 2 weeks, and then we'll bring the pool back up. How quickly that pool moves back up is driven entirely by Mother Nature. So if we have rains, relatively high inflows to the system, that refill will happen relatively quickly. If it's dry, it'll take a longer period of time. But it will happen starting December 16th at the latest at Green Peter. Okay, I think that covers it. At Green Peter, again, this is kind of the same graph. You can see the same trend that we saw over at Lookout Point as it relates to turbidity downstream of the dam. So again, under those previous drawdowns in 23 and 24, we saw our highest levels of turbidity associated with that drawdown in 23. Some of these spikes, these dramatic spikes, are typically associated with rain events on top of the drawdowns themselves. That's when we see the absolute highest levels of turbidity being released from the dam. In 24, we saw a reduction, again, in both duration and magnitude of the turbidity downstream of the dam. And then you can see this line here is 2025. So again, so far, we're doing very, very well in comparison to some of the previous years. And we will see this tick up. How far, for how long, we won't know until we do this. But the good news is, based on what we saw in 2024, we were expecting the turbidity to kind of spike up around elevation 840 in the reservoir. Again, we're already well below that. And we have not seen that signal spike yet. So that's a really good sign that this continued progress toward kind of a reduction in both duration and magnitude of the turbidity we're seeing downstream of the dams will continue to occur in 2025. Green Peter. All right, I'm going to hit real quickly on water quality. It's mostly around sediment. I'm going to just want to make this distinction that, again, when we do this full stream bed drawdown, this is actually a picture from Fall Creek, it is very different. So the kind of sediment delivery that we see downstream of on a full stream bed drawdown is really reflective of what's in the river. So you see gravels and cobbles and sands and sediments. You see this heavy delivery of sediment downstream of the dam. That's not what you see down below the reservoirs where we're doing these partial reservoir drawdowns. And that's, again, because of that residual pool. In a partial reservoir drawdown, if you think about it, anything that passes downstream, it has to pass through that stagnant residual reservoir first. So think about a piece of gravel. It's too heavy, right? So once it gets to that residual reservoir, it drops out. But only that really fine clay and that really, really, really fine stuff is what we typically see then being released downstream of the reservoirs where we have partial reservoir drawdowns. So just wanted to kind of drive that distinction home. The vast majority of what we see for sediment, and when it erodes, it gets put back and kind of resettles out in that residual reservoir. So at Green Peter, this is from 2023, the gross sediment erosion, and this is an estimate, of 4 million cubic yards. But almost of that 4 million, 3.9 million kind of resettled back into the reservoir, right? So it moved from one place in the reservoir to another and then resettled back out. You can think of the sand, sediments, the gravels, all these things. Some of it, that fine material, passed downstream and into Foster Reservoir, so a fraction of it, about 500,000. But then Foster captures some fraction of that, right? And so by the time you get downstream of the dam, you have this much smaller fraction, again, made up by that really fine material that actually passes downstream into the rivers below, either Foster or in Dexter, in the Middle Fork below Dexter Dam. That sediment that is in the reservoirs, we've sampled it a number of different times. We've characterized it. The bottom line, without getting into too many details, those sediment samples are below toxicity screening levels for metals and pesticides, those kinds of things. And we will continue to do that over time. All right, a couple of big picture things about fish passage. So these tools, this tool, drawdowns, in general, is an effective tool at passing fish downstream. Some of you probably read about the kokanee in green peter, and about 1 million kokanee passed downstream out of green peter in 2023. These drawdowns are effective at moving a lot of these fish species. So what we've been seeing with juvenile Chinook, these are mostly the test fish that we've been looking at. When we get these pools down towards those target elevations, the fish passage efficiency, in other words, how effectively a fish is able to find their way out, it's pretty high. It does work to do that. And the survival is pretty good. We're still looking at it across the different locations where we're doing this, and there's some complications around that. But suffice it to say, it is much higher than the baseline operation where you would have the turbine unit as your passage route. We have seen low numbers of naturally produced Chinook at Lookout and at Green Peter in the first couple of years, but that can change, and that varies by year. It varies by, well, there's a whole bunch of things that can drive that result. I think anecdotally, we're expecting to see more Chinook this year at Green Peter, just based on some early monitoring that we've been doing. But that's kind of stuff that we're keeping track of. All of this we're studying for years, and we're using a variety of techniques to look at downstream fish passage and how these fish perform. You really want to do this for a number of years, and B, you want to use a variety of techniques, because each of these techniques brings something to the table that helps you understand how these fish are performing during these operations. And so we're doing that. We're using I won't go into all the details, but we've got a number of techniques in place and different studies that we're doing to evaluate downstream fish passage during these operations. All right, and that's about it. So there's a QR code here. This will get you to the website, give you a bunch of probably more information you want on all kinds of things. Some of it's the old litigation. We have implementation plans for different activities that we're doing, status reports that we previously submitted that was actually part of a court order, but those kind of lay out the different operations, the different water quality results, different fish passage results that have been observed. You can get current information on reservoir levels or different kinds of turbidity data. So lots of different things that places you can get information if you want more of that. And that's all we have.
Greg, maybe leave the QR code slide up for folks in case they need it. Kelly's going to open up the chat now for folks that have questions.
Yep, it's ready to go. So how this will work is anyone who has a question, please feel free to enter it into the chat right now. We'll give you a minute to formulate those and type those in. And then I'll go ahead and one by one read through them, and Greg and Dustin and maybe some others on the phone will volunteer to answer them. I do see maybe some folks on the telephone, although I think they've jumped off. So yeah, everyone on should be able to chat in a chat. Questions welcome.
And when you read them, Kelly, I'm going to pick who gets to answer. That way it'll be efficient when it comes through here.
Sounds good. All right, our first question. What are some hypotheses as to why the turbidity is now getting lower each year?
All right, Greg. I'll let you get the first stab at that.
Yeah, I don't know that they're hypotheses other than just sort of maybe I'd put them in the category of observations, right? So based on observations from previous drawdowns, the one thing that we knew would happen, and I mentioned Fall Creek a bunch. That's the place that we've been doing drawdown operations the longest. We very clearly have observed over time that both the more often you do a drawdown and the deeper you do a drawdown, then the more likely you are to see this trend where you kind of clear out the channel, the old channel that the river's recutting, and that material gets passed downstream. And the result of that is that in future years, you end up with a situation where you have this, kind of lower duration of turbidity associated with the drawdown event typically, and then this reduction in magnitude. Now, that can vary. The things that can make that vary, it's cold and dry. You're going to see less of that material passed downstream versus it's warm and wet. You're going to see maybe more. But the big picture trend has always and typically is that you see more of, you see this reduction in both the duration and magnitude of the turbidity as that river just continues to clear that channel out year in, year out. And the sediment that had accumulated on the banks that's exposed also had been pushed in previous years, either by rain or the drawdown action of the reservoir. So it's just an observation. It's just something we know happens. How quickly it happens in an individual reservoir. Is there a scenario where we get to a point where we see very little turbidity at a green peter and a lookout? Yeah, I think that's very, very possible and likely, in fact. But how quickly that happens, we can't really know.
No additional questions yet, but we will hold on the line for a little bit, give folks a chance.
Yeah, and again, if folks don't have questions, make sure before you go that you capture the QR code and the access to the website where we'll be posting information. We're going to continue, and similar to what we did last year, we have recurring meetings with community leaders and water system providers as we work through this year's drawdown and adapt to what comes at us. Okay, I see a question from Denny. Since it takes 3 to 5 years for the return of fish from saltwater, why not wait until year 4 or 5 before drawing down from other reservoirs? Let the data inform. Okay, Greg, it's another fish question. I'm going back to you.
Yeah, so Denny, I mean, good question. I think the reality is that if you want to see and evaluate the performance of these projects over time, you do need to do the drawdowns annually, and for a number of years in a row. Inherently, when you do these things, you're going to get some variability in the actual operation because we're doing this when there's a lot of rain. There's very real possibility that we're going to have to capture water for a flood event, which we will do. And so you get some real variability in how you actually do the operations. So we want to do this for a number of years, commit to it, make sure we really truly understand how they're performing, and then we'll continue to look at each individual project over time. Yeah, I don't know that I really answered your question there, but it is something to get that individual benefit at an individual project. You really have to do these things every year, and we want to do it for at least a generation of fish, which would be the 4 or 5 years that you're talking about.
I think, Greg, wouldn't it be fair to say too that our task really specific to fish is passage at the dams, right, and trying to improve passage. So that's not something that in the BIOP is laid out as a wait and see approach. It's continued improvement, evaluate, and adjust your operations to improve on those, but trying to do the very best we can to improve conditions for fish passage. What happens in the ocean and returns is a different equation.
Yeah.
Okay, I see the water quality and turbidity are the most important consequences to people at Staten, Salem, downstream of Detroit. How precise can you control and preserve the water quality, and what's the danger posed to filtration system? Lebanon and other cities have seen severe damage. Are you anticipating a repeat of this? So, Catherine, I'm going to let you come off mute, and I'll start it by saying that, we have been doing extensive coordination and communication with the cities of Salem, Staten, and other potentially affected water systems downstream. Very aware of what their concerns are, and so as you raise the question, the supplemental EIS, which evaluates the impact of that drawdown, will be released tomorrow. And so how we operate and how we approach that drawdown, which will look very different than year one of Green Peter, which is what everybody, I think, has kind of etched in their minds. I just say that that's going to be very different and takes into account the concerns of those downstream communities. So, Catherine, see if you anything I missed up there.
Dustin. Yeah, can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Okay, great. Yeah, thanks for the plug for the supplemental EIS. Like Dustin said, that document will be released for public comment tomorrow, and that's a 45-day public comment period. So we really encourage folks to read through that document and provide comment. Specific to the North Santiam, I think that's what the question is mostly related to. Yeah, we've learned a lot about the drawdowns that we first implemented under the court injunction. And one of the primary mitigation measures that we're going to use is a more gradual drawdown. So instead of in the first year, like we did for Green Peter and Lookout Point, where we went all the way from where we typically go to this lowest elevation, proposed at Detroit is a slower drawdown, where in the first year we step incrementally down, the next year a little further, the next year a little further, so that we can gradually step down to that drawdown and allow for ample time for the river and the upper part of the reservoir to cut that new channel, but only small pieces of the reservoir or small pieces of the river at the time. And we think we can really limit the amount of turbidity that is scoured and moved downstream by going with a more gradual and stepwise approach to that drawdown. Like Dustin said, we continue to communicate very, very closely with the cities. We've had multiple meetings with communities in the North Santiam River ahead of any drawdown at Detroit. And we also are now having weekly meetings with communities in the Middle Fork, Willamette, downstream of Lookout Point and Dexter, as well as in the South Santiam, downstream of Green Peter and Foster. We're also coordinating very, very closely with the states, particularly Oregon Health Authority. And I think that between a combination of that increased communication, learning more from one another, and learning more from past drawdowns, that really helps. That's really helping us to shape these operations. So we're providing an improvement for fish passage and meeting our ESA obligations, but also reducing impacts to those communities.
Thanks, KT.
Yeah, you bet.
All right, Greg, I know you've been waiting. You've got an answer ready for this one. If drawdowns don't work, will the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers implement fish ladders?
Yeah. So, and maybe I shouldn't have taken the slides down. So, and maybe it's just the terminology, but fish ladders at these projects are not going to work for downstream fish passage, and aren't going to work realistically for upstream fish passage either. So we will always be in the business of doing trap and haul like we have been doing at the Willamette project. And that's in part because of the large seasonal drawdown that we do to accommodate floodwaters. Just the length that you would have to have on a fish ladder of that style at the height of these dams would be, in some cases, well over a mile long. And so it's just not a feasible thing. It certainly would have been something the Corps knew how to build We built Bonneville Dam with volitional fish passage upstream before any of the Willamette project dams. So it wasn't a lack of knowledge, wasn't a lack of desire. It was really just something that wasn't something that we could do. Now, I think when you talk about downstream fish passage, that's where you do get into this discussion about what approach that you take. And what we focused entirely on tonight was things in what we would call the operational bucket, right? So operational fish passage really falls into a couple of different types of operations. They are spill. So I mentioned that, in the summer and the spring, we can use our existing spillway gates. That works. These drawdowns is a way to do it. And then under the injunction, we did something, and we still have on the books, something called the delayed refill. We're doing that at Cougar Dam. It's just keeping the pool down instead of filling it. But the idea is the same. You keep the fish at closer proximity to the existing gate structures to find their way out. What we didn't talk about at all, and what can work and does work, but has a set of pros and cons associated with it, is some kind of structural solution. And these structures come in all kinds of different configurations, costs, etc. And we have, in some cases, proposed those as long-term solutions, but they're very costly. They take a long time to get in place. And the reality is many of them have had, pretty variable results associated with them. And so I think our reality in the Willamette as it relates to downstream fish passage is this. To the extent that we get support to build structures, and when I say support, funding primarily, but we will always have a need for some kind of bridge operation to whatever that long-term solution is. And if that's a structure, that means we're likely going to be doing some kind of bridge. We will be doing some kind of bridge operation. And that bridge operation is going to be in that operational bucket. So it's either going to be a spill or likely one of these drawdowns. I mean, that is just reality. And maybe that bridge is in place for 5 years, 10 years, 20 years till you get to that permanent solution. Or maybe it is your reality. You continue to operate operationally for downstream fish passage, but the fish ladders are just not something or the structural. Eventually, the structurals could be something you see in the Willamette. And we can talk about those, if you want more detail on those. But yeah, you will have these operations in place for the foreseeable future, just as a bridge operation, if nothing else.
I'll let you catch your breath, Greg, but don't go off mute just yet. So the next question is, can you measure the effects of non-native species that are being flushed downstream and then prey on salmon and steelhead smolts?
Yeah, it's a great question. And you may have seen the articles that have come out recently kind of around this topic. And I mentioned this a little bit when I was talking about the partial versus the full stream bed drawdowns. And I mentioned that there's very different effects around, well, especially that issue. So with these drawdowns, here's what happens. They don't typically select between fish species. A little bit of that happens. In other words, like if you have a bass in your reservoir, they are a little less likely to kind of migrate downstream because that's just not what they do. But the reality is a lot of them still will be moved downstream. And so we've seen that. And with these partial reservoir drawdowns, whatever's been in that reservoir, generally speaking, is going out. And each of our reservoirs is a little bit different in terms of what fish species are present, but many of them, because the reservoirs have a significant number of non-native species in them. So those are being pushed downstream. Now, that was always true because those fish were always being pushed downstream just under normal operations. But the drawdowns, because they are effective and they are, kind of bringing the pool down, we absolutely are seeing more of those fish go downstream. We don't know what that's going to mean long term. And if you read the article that Zach Ernest did on walleye in the Willamette that recently came out, there's that article just kind of has a number of folks that sort of speculate about what could happen, right? Obviously, there's not a desire to see something like walleye take hold in the Willamette. That would add another predator that we don't need for native salmon and steelhead that we're trying to pass downstream successfully. So it's a huge concern. We don't know. It is one of many, many trade-offs that you make when you do an operation like this. That is the reality. You're making trade-offs. This is one of them, a risk you take. And so we will see. What has been true in the Willamette, even, outside of this, has been that we have seen a continued increase in the distribution of non-native fish species in the Willamette upstream. So, the most obvious example of that is smallmouth bass. We have hundreds of thousands of smallmouth bass in the Willamette, hundreds of thousands. They're not, you're never getting rid of them. They will be there. They'll continue to be there. It's likely their distribution will continue to shift upstream, which it has. That is just something you're gonna manage around. It's just going to be there. Obviously, we hope something like walleye or some of the other species that are present don't gain a toehold in the upper watershed. It would be a negative impact, no doubt.
All right, I'm going to answer the next one from Tom. Give Greg a little bit of a break. The question is, if we keep green Peter at complete drawdown and the vegetation takes over, can we allow adult fish to spawn? And Greg touched on this a little bit earlier, right? Obviously, because we tend to focus on drawdowns as far as fish passage goes, but we have other operational measures in place. Topspill. There's every incentive for us to try to store water, as much water as we can in the system, for fish passage, for water quality, for water supply, and those authorities are still there. So the intent at Green Peter is not to keep it at complete drawdown. Some of these reservoirs, especially where we have interim risk reduction measures and drawdowns, at the upper ends of the pools, you do see some changes in vegetation. You might see some changes around the upper bands in the reservoirs, but and something we will probably want to monitor over time, but not something you would expect to see a major change in the system that would affect fish spawning. You might see a slight benefit to some of the non-native warm water species from that. But again, we've been doing these types of drawdowns in the past. This is still a very short window of time, and then you have that in that deep cover. It doesn't really allow for vegetation to get established in some of those new areas in the reservoir. Okay, I know we are at time. Happy to continue to stay on for a few more questions. Can you stop the turbines temporarily to help DSM? Downstream migrants?
Yeah. I'm assuming that's what he's saying. So yeah, Tom, and maybe I didn't do a good job of kind of laying that out, but we have our turbines only operate within a certain range of the reservoir. And so that generally is relatively shallow, just below our minimum conservation pool. Essentially, they can't operate. And so we're not operating them during the drawdown as it exists now. And so we just take them out of the equation. They're essentially out of the equation for the vast majority of that drawdown, especially the part where the fish are actually moving out of the dam. So they're just not part of the equation.
And then at other periods in the year where we're doing top spill operations, again, they're not finding those lower outlets, so we're not expecting they would see big
No.
impacts to fish passage there.
Right, not effectively. No.
Okay. Well, again, thank you for your time tonight and your interest. We will continue as we work through this to communicate through a variety of methods on how the operation is going this year. As Greg mentioned earlier in the sites we posted, the results of those operations will continue to be made visible to folks, and we will continue to work to adapt these operations to do the very best we can, both in terms of fish passage, but also to mitigate impacts downstream. And we are learning and evolving as we go through this. Thank you for the time tonight. Appreciate everybody showing up on a Thursday night when they probably need to be cooking dinner for the family.
Thanks, everybody.